Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament here in Brussels, which is the heart of the European Union. And in today's programme, we're going to be discussing Syria. As the crisis in Syria is escalating, and it's believed that the Syrian regime has used chemical and biological weapons on its own people. So we'll be discussing what are the consequences of the regime's actions against its own people, and also what are the implications of Western military involvement in Syria, and should we not understand the whole strategic ramifications of possibly US military action against Assad's regime. Also in this programme as well, we'll be discussing the Egyptian crisis and how Christians in Egypt have faced their own Kristallnacht, in which over 67 churches and monasteries have been attacked, and yet here in the EU there's been silence. The mainstream media have been silent on this issue, and this is something that we need to speak up about. So thank you for joining me on today's European Report. MEP Hannu Takala from the Finnish Centre Party, and Paolo Kosaka, who's an expert on Iran and the Middle East. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Middle East Report. I'll start off with you, Hannu. How was your recess, and what does this parliamentary year mean for you?
It's the last year before the elections, and of course, it's going to be a very interesting year, and we have a lot of on the agenda at the moment, and of course there are a lot of big issues concerning the Middle East. Now the Syria, it's the most urgent issue at the moment, and of course Israel, peace process, and many others. And then, as we all know, in the Europe at the moment we have the financial crisis, so we have to do something also in that field. So I think it's going to be very busy and very interesting year. And when the elections comes, of course, it means that March or April, the members they are in the member states, and they do campaigning. So what can I say? It's going to be busy and interesting year.
I know a lot of our Finnish viewers will certainly be wanting to vote for you when you come up for re-election, and if you're British, I would encourage all of our viewers watching today's programme to get behind you and support you, because it's so important we have bold and courageous MEPs like yourself standing for Islam, standing for truth and righteousness here in the European Parliament.
Thank you.
Paolo, it's great to have you back on the programme. Did a superb job on the last programme back in July. August is usually a quiet month, but we've seen so much happen in the Middle East, with Iran, with Syria and Egypt. In a nutshell, what do you think are the key developments that we should look out for and trends that are taking place in that very volatile region?
Thank you very much, Simon, for your welcome words. And I'm really very pleased to be next to Hannu, a very, very good colleague that I certainly would recommend as a parliamentarian for our Finnish co-European citizens. I think that the major feeling among the European public opinion is that there is a sense of being lost, because so many things are happening, so many actors, that the normal citizen is really unable to cope. And I think that most of the press has not been very helpful, because it has been contributing more to the confusion than to the clarification. It is true that there are several extremist groups of several obedience, and sometimes they are allied, some other times they quarrel one with the other. This is a reality, but this should not hide the fact that a very serious step was given by Assad regime in Syria, and this step is unequivocal. They bombed with chemical weapons civilian population. This is, at this stage, for those who have moral standing and some information, this is undeniable. We cannot hide this from anyone else. What we can discuss, and it's perhaps a must, is why did it happen, what is happening on the ground, what is the best answer. I think, in my personal opinion, what we see now in Syria is that Assad is more and more a prisoner of Iran and its forces. It is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards that are calling the shots in Syria. They are the ones who are organizing the mercenary forces from Lebanon, Hezbollah from Lebanon, but from Iraq as well. That the press did not say a word about that. But for instance, I think it was in the beginning of August, a nephew of the Prime Minister Maliki had a funeral, and Maliki was there, and it was a big event because he died in combating for Assad in Syria. So the same that happens in Lebanon happens in Iraq, because the procedures are very similar. These are countries where Iran as following organizations. So I think that in Syria, Assad means every time less, and Iran means every time more. And I seriously doubt that Assad would ever give this step of bombing by chemical weapons his own population without, at the very least, approval from the leaders of the Iranian regime. I doubt it very much.
I agree with you very much on that point. And you've had a busy summer, haven't you, Thomas? I know that you've just come back from Jerusalem, so can you share with us some of the news information you have to share?
Well, thank you, Simon. It's good to be back, and good to be back with such good and knowledgeable friends as Hanno and Paolo. And I should also add my support to Hanno. But not only that, I wish that Paolo would be back in the parliament next year. And I'm trying my best to convince him, because we need him in this parliament. Yes, it's true. I just came back Friday from Jerusalem after having spent 3 days in meetings with government leaders, and also met with the Speaker of the Knesset. Obviously, you know, they are not in a position to share information which you cannot find in media. So I would lie if I said that I have something very, confidential information that I could share on this program directly from Israel. But obviously the situation was tense, and the people that we stayed with, you know, they were checking their gas masks, you know, just to make sure that they were in order. And you could sense the tension in the air. But nevertheless, I do admire their leaders, the people as such, living in this constant threat of attacks. And there's a good story from one of the news programs. The news came on, and they said, well, today Iran has pledged that they will attack Israel as soon as someone will attack Syria. And then he continued and say, and the weather will remain the same. So even in the midst of these crises, there is humor, and there is a very calm way of dealing with these things.
Absolutely. I think that's a Jewish experience, though. I just want to read out these very interesting letters. We're talking about Syria, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Egypt and the Middle East. And this one, a short guide to the Middle East, and it says, Sir, Iran is backing Assad. Gulf states are against Assad. Assad is against the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood and Obama are against General Sisi. But the Gulf states are pro-Sisi, which means they are against the Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is pro-Hamas, but Hamas is backing the Muslim Brotherhood. Obama is backing the Muslim Brotherhood, yet Hamas is against the US. The Gulf states are pro-US, but Turkey is with the Gulf states against Assad, yet Turkey is pro-Muslim Brotherhood against General Sisi. And General Sisi is backed by the Gulf states. Welcome to the Middle East and have a nice day. I think that sums up the whole situation we're facing in the Middle East right now. Hanu, what is your response to what we've seen happen in Syria over the last month, that the regime is believed to have used chemical or biological weapons on its own people, killed over 1,000, I think it's around 1,500 people through sarin gas, and clearly goes against all military conventional warfare and the Geneva Convention. What is your response to what has happened in Syria?
True, the use of chemical weapons and biological weapons is awful, and it is recognized as a crime against humanity. Of course, ideally, using such weapons should be made impossible, but how do we do that? That's the question. Anyway, I think that anyone who using them has to be punished, and intelligence should find out the sources of the chemical weapons. Actions could be taken against the suppliers, companies and or countries. And if the military attack is really the only way to halt the use the chemical weapons in Syria, we have to make absolutely sure this is the right way. Wrong action risk increase violence and extremist and runs a risk of the conflict expanding to the whole region. And blindly lending support to Syrian opposition is not the answer. As you may know, I met the Archbishop of Syria, or Patriarch of Syria, Georgios of III, if I remember here, Georgios of III, and he said to me that Christians in Syria are not favored in the military stakes against Assad, because they think that for them it's easier to live under this regime, or if extreme Muslims, Sunnis, take over and take power.
Yeah. And Paolo, what's happening in Syria is horrific. I mean, not only talking about the humanitarian crisis now that over 100,000 Syrians have been killed in this conflict, together now with a refugee problem of over 2 million people and 7 million displaced within Syria itself. Now it's believed that the regime is using chemical and biological weapons. There's calls upon the United States to take military action against the regime. But is there not a great danger that we're getting embroiled in another war like we did with Iraq, but without ignoring the Iranian influence and in this conflict?
Well, the war started long ago, because there are already 100,000 victims of this war. So the war has been ongoing, and the public opinion has exactly this image that you just reported right now, that this is very confusing. The issue is that we should learn the lessons of Iraq. The number one lesson is never lie. And this has been the most important problem. Of course, a lot of the public opinion say, okay, you tell us that there are chemical weapons in Syria, but you did say the same thing on Iraq, and it was a lie. Either the United States have an answer for this, and they should have an answer for this, and I did not see it up to now, or they have a serious problem. Well, the second issue is that, of course, Assad is not the only evil person on the ground, and this is quite true. You have a lot of other extremist forces, namely several Al-Qaeda groups and Muslim Brotherhood that is not very different and is very much aligned with Al-Qaeda. And of course I do share the opinion of the Archbishop that there is no difference between both of them. And this was exactly the error that was done in Iraq. The West replaced Saddam Hussein, who was a terrible dictator, no doubt about that, by the Iranian stooges that are no better at all. And this is a tremendous mistake. So before we speak about military actions, we should speak with the people on the ground. There was not a long time ago a conference here in the European Parliament made by a Syriac Christian organization. I think they have a lot of truth on what they are saying. They do not at all sponsor Assad, not at all. They think that this regime should be removed, but the essential is to build the secular coalition, putting aside all religious extremists. And the secular coalition, of course, can never ignore the Kurds. The Kurds are a fundamental part for it. Of course, cannot ignore none of the other minorities, the Druze, for instance, and several others that exist within Syria. And the bulk of the population that, as we know, is Muslim, Sunni, should also be involved, but of course in a non-confessional way. And the reason why during these 2 years there has been a drift towards Islamists is that the West allowed it to happen. The West allowed it to happen. The West gave a green card for Turkey to do whatever they want. And of course, Turkey is favoring Islamists because we spoke about Muslim Brotherhood, but Mr. Erdogan is the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's face reality. Let's stop to produce fantasies. Muslim Brotherhood is a complex organization. Of course, that Mr. Erdogan has a lot of differences and rivalries with the Egyptian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it covers nearly all the Muslim world. And this organization has an extremist view of what should be done in the world. They really want to rebuild a caliphate. They have a very anti-Western ideology. And we cannot consider these people to be allies. Sometimes, as it happened in the past, we remember about the Second World War, sometimes the West made alliances with, I would say, with the devil, because the Soviet Union is not very far from this, from the devil. I wouldn't say that sometimes you are not forced to do a thing like that, but you should be always very careful when you are dealing with the devil, because it is the devil. It's not a good person.
Couldn't agree more. And Thomas, isn't there a great danger here that last year President Obama made it very, very clear that there were red lines and there were conditions, and if the regime crossed those red lines, then they'd feel the full force of American military power. Now he seems to be backpedaling. Now it's a situation unlike Britain where he's trying to seek congressional support in order to conduct military action, and it looks like it's going to be something on small scale. But isn't American danger of losing her influence and power in the Middle East and being seen as a paper tiger if America doesn't act?
Well, when it comes to Obama and his influence in the Middle East, I have always been of the opinion that he has created more confusion than clarity. Confusion as to where the United States actually stands on these issues which are, basic to fundamental human rights and freedoms. And his speech in Egypt during his first period was, for me, like letting the spirit out of the bottle. And that is, the Muslim Brotherhood basically legitimizing that force. And now, many years after, we see the consequence of that in that whole region. I also think his policies have been rather inconsistent and incoherent. And it's very difficult, it's confusing, even for the allies to really understand where he stands, not to mention the different nations in that region, both the allies and the enemies. And thirdly, I think that once you use a language of saying, well, this is the red line, and the red line is clearly crossed, and if you don't deliver, you do send not only a confusing message to the region, but also a message of weakness. We can be sure that people in North Korea and in Iran are taking very close note of, how will he act? Will he act at all? And they will draw their own consequences out of that. So we'll see. I mean, I do agree with what both Hanno and Paolo is saying, that Of course, we have to establish the facts on the ground. We have to get this confirmed, what actually did happen. And you may also say that there is some wisdom in not rushing into things based on allegations, but having the clear facts, ideally having the backing of the United Nations, but certainly of the Congress then in the United States. So on the one hand, yes, creating a confusion, having an incoherent policy, but I think we should also give a certain amount of credibility in trying to build a coalition before taking action.
Yep. And Paolo, isn't there a great danger here that when we look at the situation in Syria, it's incredibly complex? Is this something that if the West gets involved in military intervention in Syria, whether it's the French or the United States, Britain's no longer going to be part of that because Parliament voted against military action, that we could actually stir up a real hornet's nest? And at the moment, the conflict in Syria is really a conflict between Sunni and Shia control, dominance and influence over the region. What, in your opinion, what do you think the implications are for the West if we get involved in military action?
Well, to start with, I would perhaps make a point that I think is a precision that is very important. What we have seen in the last few months in Syria is that there is a different, completely different strategy from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates from one side and Turkey from the other side. Turkey is supporting Islamists, obviously, clearly, Al-Qaeda linked groups and Muslim Brotherhood, and Saudi Arabia has not. Saudi Arabia is the backing of the Free Syrian Army, basically. So it shows that behind the religion stamp, there are geopolitical differences. There is a detail that people tend to forget. Iran as a country, well, the Persia of that time, became Shia with the Safavids only in the 16th century. They were not Shia. It was not at all. The bulk of Iran was Sunni, was not Shia. The Shias were coming from Iraq. And why did the Safavids make obligatory the conversion of the country to Shiism? In their plan to dispute the power from the Ottomans of Turkey, that was Sunnis. It was purely a geopolitical, a power issue. It was not a theological question. And I think to a large extent, in our day, it's the same thing. You have different views of the issues that use, sometimes I would say, misuse religion, but the religion is not the most important fact. I am convinced that as it happened so for centuries, that Sunnis and Alawites, there are not so many Shias in Syria, but there are Alawites and there are Druze and there are so many other people. Well, they live together. And I think it's possible and it is desirable and it is absolutely fundamental that we support their living together. So I would say before sending the missiles, put the policy right and try to build the coalition on the ground that we need to be formed. We cannot allow those who are for a democratic Syria to be combating each other, because some are Kurds and the others are Christians and the others are Sunni. This is not possible. We have to tell them very clearly, listen, you have to come to terms ones with the others. Otherwise, there's no possible game. And then we must make a military evaluation of the situation. For instance, I think that cutting the supply routes to Assad from Iran might be more productive and more important than sending some missiles, for instance. This is something we could do. There is leverage to do that. Of course, if we understand what's going on in Iraq. But if we pretend that Iraq is a democratic country, of course, we will go nowhere because we are not seeing the reality. So we have to see the reality in the first place. I'm not a military expert. So the military options, there is time to take them, but there are no it's not possible to have good military options on the Iranians' political reading of the region. It's not possible. It's not a military issue. It is a political issue. As Thomas said a while ago, Iran is the issue.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the report of I read it carefully of the report that the French authorities made public of their intelligence, you see that they stop in Assad, but they don't say, well, but Assad took the decision of chemical bombardment without considering what Iran thinks about it. It's impossible. He would never do that. He is not in a position to do a thing like that. So, and why the French authorities did not go to this point? Because they are afraid of confronting Iran. So they think that they will have a half victory. They think that they can teach Assad and not confronting Iran and everything will go as before. It's impossible. This will never happen. And this is exactly what is wrong in the way that the Western countries are doing on the region.
Well, I hope our Western leaders take note of what you said. I think it's a very good idea to kind of stop the supply of weapons to Assad's regime from Iran. And, if they're watching, take note. And Hanu, this week we've had a report from the UN that's detailed that in Syria now there are over 2 million refugees. Over 100,000 Syrians have died in this conflict, and it's also led to a refugee problem within Syria of over 7 million people being displaced from their homes within Syria. What can the EU do, and what can the European Parliament do to help alleviate some of the horrendous suffering of the Syrian people?
The EU, through this humanitarian aid program, is by far already the biggest donor in the region. So far it has provided about 1 billion euro, and roughly half is coming for the EU budget and one other half coming for the individual member states. And I find out that, for example, Finland, where I'm from, is the 7th biggest donor, 12 million, and the United Kingdom is the biggest. There is more than 200 million euro what your country have already gave to Syria. So I would like to raise the question that where is the solidarity among Arab states?
That's a good question.
So where is the Arab countries? Because European Union is, as I said, already the biggest donor in the region. Of course, the long-term goal is to help the Syrian people to secure a lasting peace within the country, so that those who have left because of the conflict can return home and continue their lives in their home country. Of course, that's the goal what we're looking for. But before that, we have done a lot, and I think that first thing, in somehow we have to find ceasefire, that the conflict, both parties can then start the negotiations with the EU and the international community. That's the first step, and then of course the further on looking for the lasting peace.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, isn't it, to think that the EU, for example, and European countries are more concerned about the plight of Syrian refugees than the Arab states, who should really be looking after their own people and taking more of a responsibility. And particularly the Arab League, for example, could be doing a lot more.
That's right. And I think that now we have to put a little bit pressure for the Arab countries, but because it seems to me that they neglect, they don't do what they have to do, and they, in the other occasions, they talk about the cooperation, and it might be, I put it in that way, that if they do something against Israel, then they find each other very easily. But if they have to help some of their brothers or sisters, then in some reasons they can't find each other, and that's quite interesting.
And maybe some of the solution is that they should divert a lot of the money that's being wasted, that's going into UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Agency, and should be used to actually help support the Syrian refugees. That seems to be the priority right now. How important is it for Christians to really stand up for our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who are suffering incredible persecution in this conflict?
Obviously, it's extremely important for us as Christians to remember our brothers and sisters in Syria, to pray for them, and obviously then to ask the logical question, what can we do? And what can the international community do? What suggestions are we coming with in this situation? It's obviously in a military situations like that, it's not very easy to come with practical solutions. Once you have come through this slippery slope and it's the slaughtering, you can change the question and said, we should have been on our guard several years ago. I think also what we need to remember is that the fact that Assad is a butcher doesn't mean that those who want to topple him are any better. And I think there you see from time to time a certain level of naivety in the Western community that and it's clear, I mentioned it before, that Obama has been promoted the Muslim Brotherhood, and now you see having then links to Al-Qaeda, and now you see what we get both in Egypt and Syria. So I think we need to be to raise our concern in the public arena, to really make it clear that just because there are groups that want to topple Assad, we cannot give them a blank check. And we need to be even more articulate here in the European Parliament, in our national parliaments, in media, to raise this issue on the agenda.
No, very important. And Paolo, surely some of the best policies the EU can pursue, and also the United States, is a policy of containment, particularly in Syria, of containing Iran and containing the rise of Sunni extremism in the region. What are your policy recommendations for our Western leaders in the EU and also in the United States?
Well, I think that what you see in Syria is that the general phenomena of the Arab Spring could not be achieved there simply because you have the most ruthless power in the region, which is Iran, that said, no way, because we need Syria is ours, and whatever it takes, if we need to kill civilians by gas, we do it, whatever it takes, we will not allow this to happen. And this is the major issue. You have, unfortunately, a lot of hate ideologies on the ground. Al-Qaeda is the most well-known. It's not the single brand, but between the whole of them, there is one that is more dangerous than all the others. And why is it the more dangerous? Well, because it comes from the most developed country in the region, which is Iran. Intellectually, it is a very developed country because it is very much centralized. There is a spiritual guide that really calls all the shots of whatever is done by this country. And this country has a long-term strategy to reach the Mediterranean. And that's what they achieved now in Iraq. And of course, for them, it would be tragic to win Iraq and lose Syria. So they do not want this to happen, whatever the costs. This is the main problem and the main issue. And of course, besides that, what you have is a lot of other powers that unfortunately think that they have to rival with the same sort of jihadist instruments. And we are seeing the drift of Turkey. That is quite obvious. Not because I think Mr. Erdogan changed so much. I don't think it changed. I mean, he is the same, but he's showing more openly what he is right now than he used to do. And of course, his plans are really not very good. I mean, he really wants to reestablish a caliphate as well. And so you have a lot of other nasty powers coming ahead, but one has to concentrate on the major strategic threat, and this one is from Iran. If we would cut the supply routes to Assad, I think he would not last much. And this is exactly what I would advise for the European Union leaders to do.
That's interesting. And Paolo, I mean, this summer there has been so much going on in the Middle East. I mean, Syria is up in flames with a civil war. Iran is edging closer and closer to nuclear weapons. There's been another revolution in Egypt. And yet there seems to be this obsession here in the EU about imposing economic sanctions upon Israeli goods at a time when the peace process is just starting to be renewed a bit between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Do you think this is the right time for the EU to kind of pushing through and containing Israel instead of spending more diplomatic energy in Syria, Iran and Egypt?
Yeah, I have to say that the decision made by Baroness Ashton was something what I really don't understand, and I sent a letter for her and concerning that. And also it was a few months ago when she said, or she gave some interview, and she said that the biggest problem in the Middle East at the moment is the Israel settlements. And that shows me that in somehow, unfortunately, she is out of the picture. And I sent a letter for her, and concerning that, I now am waiting for her answer. So I think that that's clear for everyone that at the moment the most urgent problem is the situation in Syria. And that's clear. And however, Egypt, Iran, Israel, not be forgotten. And what comes to Israel, I would like to say that personally I think that more should be done to support Israel. It is the only true democratic country in the region, and I think that strong Israel could build stability to the whole region and act as a balancing factor against the nuclear threat and the war and against the intolerance of extremist Islam. So I think that at the moment what we can do and what we have to do, we have to support Israel, because Israel is a democratic country and share the same values than European Union. So I think that's our normal partner there, and those sanctions and those statements what Baroness Ashton has gave, so they are totally something what I can't agree.
And Thomas, I mean, Israel, the Israeli government are very, very concerned with the hesitancy of President Barack Obama in the United States for not fulfilling his commitment, and particularly in reference to the red lines he made before about the regime using chemical and biological weapons. Is there not a great danger now that if, for example, America doesn't take military action against Assad's regime, then this means that the Iranians will see this as a red light to continue, or green light, sorry, to continue advancing their nuclear weapons program without a fear of attack or retaliation?
Yeah, I think as I said before, that the world is watching, Iran is watching, and other, similar states are watching very carefully. And the feeling I had in Jerusalem last week was that there was a feeling of abandonment. Will the US really step in? Will we, at the end of the line, be on our own? And of course, if this is the case with Syria, that Obama would decide for whatever reasons not to get involved, of course, I think it's not very difficult to understand what would happen as it relates to Iran. So I think that if the US doesn't act coherently at this stage, it's again a very difficult situation, a slippery slope that is not promising much security for Israel or cooperation from their allies when it comes to dealing with Iran. But let me say just a few words about the EU and these guidelines which came out in mid-July. We have also written an open letter to Catherine Ashton when we are disputing many of her main arguments when it comes to the legalities of the settlements. And I think the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Elmar Brok, made a very interesting comment, being perhaps the most prominent member in this House, where he said that this only shows how out of touch the EU officials, the EU bureaucrats are with the real world. As they get obsessed with these guidelines, it's like they're not even watching the news to see what is really going on in that region. And I think it's much more difficult for both political leaders and normal people like ourselves to take them really seriously. Lastly, there was a caricature which I saw recently, picturing the whole neighborhood, the Middle East, as a neighborhood with, Israel one house and Lebanon another house and Syria another house. And the police came to the house which said Israel, and they were complaining and said, well, why are you disturbing all our neighbors? And I think it's a caricature, but it could have been, created by Baroness Ashton, sadly.
And the next issue that we're going to discuss is what can only be described as Egyptian Christians' own Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, that occurred in November 1938, when synagogues and Jewish businesses were destroyed and attacked right across Germany. And today this has happened in Egypt with supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood attacking Christian monasteries and churches. It's believed to be around 67, and yet we see and hear nothing, no condemnation from the EU, very little media attention and focus on this, and this is something that all Christians watching should be very concerned and very alarmed. Hannu, what is your take on what's happened in the last month in Egypt and the unprecedented attack on Christian churches, on Christian monasteries, Christian bookshop, and the Christian community, which is about 67 churches and monasteries that have been either attacked or burnt to the ground with the violence caused by the Muslim Brotherhood?
So when President Mubarak fell, I said that the development would not bring about a good result. The EU and the international community wanted to have the elections. Of course, the EU was and is the favor of free democratic elections, but I was pessimistic of the outcome, not the process. The process is okay, but we have to remember that Muslim countries, they don't have that kind of concept, which name is democracy. And but what we can say when a democratic conducted elections fails, as it had done within the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think that in the European Union, the EU has a democracy program where one of the issues is democracy training and institution building. And this is what very much needed in the countries where democracy is oppressed. And as I said, that it seems to me that in Europe and inside the European Union, we really don't know the Islam and we really don't know that democracy, it's clear for us, but it's something, that concept, it's not clear for them. And it seems to me that they think about it, one election and only once, and then who elected, that's it. And democracy means much more. It's a human rights, a freedom of express, and all those things. What comes to Christians, as the actual persecution took place, if the EU felt to be too silent, the civil society and individuals, citizens must be loud and voice their opinions more empathically. I'm afraid that even we Christians have been too silent about the persecution within the Egyptian Christians have been suffering for many years, and which has increased in over recent months. So I can ask why. Of course, EU has to make some actions, but also I think that Christian community, us, we have to do something and raise this issue more and more.
Yeah, and Thomas, this issue makes me very, very angry, primarily because what we saw in November 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, was Jewish synagogues burnt down all across Germany. We saw the attack on Jewish businesses, which then led further to the annihilation of the Jewish people by the Nazi regime and Hitler's madness. And yet we're seeing the same thing happen in Egypt today, with 67 churches and monasteries burnt down and attacked, Christians, women raped, and kidnapping of so many other Christians. And yet the EU is so silent on this issue, the media is silent, and the world is silent. Why is this the case?
Well, it's a good question. I would say that you can clearly see elements of racism in different ways. I think the perception in the Western world, including Europe, is that whoever is a Christian is a European, it's it's almost like saying it's a colonialist. And whereas the picture geographically today of a Christian is someone who is typically living in the southern hemisphere, is black more often than white, is poor more often than rich. And I think still the perception is so new here in Europe. We feel like, well, Christian, that's us. But it's not the case. Racism, I mean, because on the one hand, when you look at people suffering, take the case of Sudan earlier, maybe it was so that, you know, these people were black Africans. Maybe, again, the fact that this is happening in Egypt, it's easier to close our eyes. Maybe there is an element of racism. But also, thirdly, I think racism is there because we don't expect the same behavior from the governments in these countries. So it's like we have a double standard. We say on the one hand we have the UN Charter of Human Rights, but of course we can't take it too seriously in countries like Egypt or Syria because, well. And I think this is racism. If we don't expect the same behavior of you, regardless of which of the 193 member states of the United Nations we are talking about, it's not fair. And it then boils down to the people who are suffering, that we are not putting the leaders, making the leaders accountable. And here, as Hannu just said, I think we as civil society has a lot more to do just to raise this issue and to act before it's too late.
And, Paolo, it's only my observations, but seeing the second revolution occur in Egypt in which General Sisi has taken power, also thanks to over 30 million people taking to the streets right across Egypt in a protest against President Morsi's Islamification of Egypt. But why does it seem that the EU is backing Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood against the forces of freedom in Egypt and certainly against Egyptian public opinion?
It all comes from the same appeasement ideology and attitude that the European leaders are showing, as their ancestors did as well, unfortunately, in the 30s of the 20th century. And it shows up in saying, well, Jerusalem is the problem in the Middle East. I mean, one needs to be a complete idiot or not to know what he's speaking about to think of a thing like that. But I often, the misinformation campaign is so intense. I did meet friends of mine that obviously had, some of them, they have been, for instance, in the Gaza Strip, and they was, oh, tremendous, like a ghetto. And I was looking at them, and they do not make the faintest idea of what they are speaking about. I mean, the Gaza Strip, it's luxury compared with most of what I know in Iraq. Let's be very, very clear on this. But who speaks about this? Who speaks about, the Copts, which are already under Mubarak, and that's why they were not very happy with Mubarak, were another class and were completely mistreated. And I remember to have discussed several times with the Copt leaders and telling them, well, you might be right, but I can assure you something, you will miss Mubarak, because Mubarak might be bad, but the Muslim Brotherhood is 10 times worse than Mubarak. And of course, they learned it. The coup of Morsi declared his absolute powers. And this coup, the real coup was then, not afterwards, contrarily to what has been said in the press. And nobody said nothing about that. And when the Muslim Brotherhood was making these extensive pogroms of burning everything related to Christians, the European leadership was saying, oh, poor Muslim Brotherhood that is being persecuted. They were actually supporting the pogroms of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was one of the most shameful ever moments of the Western diplomacies. I think that Baroness Ashton has to apologize to Egyptians, especially to the Coptic communities. What she did is absolutely unforgivable. If she does not know what is going on, what is she doing there? Doesn't she have services nobody tells her about? How can she show her solidarity with those who are making pogroms? How is it possible? How can we admit it? Because in Iraq, where the same sort of thing happened, as a matter of fact, you can always say, well, you cannot really understand it from the public opinion in the press and so on. But here, this was clear. And by the way, regarding pogroms, one thing that the Iran is trying to convince is that they are softer and they are more gentle regarding Christians. Well, I would just ask something. How many Christians there are in our day in Basra, in the south of Iraq? How many? They have been all ethnically cleansed. And it was not Al-Qaeda, that does not exist in Basra. It was the Shia extremists that are absolutely no better, no different from Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Gentlemen, down to less than 5 minutes of the programme. So Hanu, for our viewers watching today's programme who are concerned about the plight of Christians, not only in Syria, but also in Egypt as well, because this is, I believe, what's happened in Egypt in the last month is unprecedented. What can they do in terms of contacting their local MEPs and their national parliaments and having an influence on the EU institutions to take this issue of persecutions of Christians more seriously?
Yeah, I think that there's a danger that we too easily turn to the EU, expecting it comes to rescue and solve any problems there.
The track record's not great on that one, is it?
World. But however, we should not forget what Christian brotherhood or sisterhood means, especially as regards our brothers and sisters who are victims of persecutions in the Middle East. Individual Christians and churches and Christian communities can and should do much more to show real solidarity to the Egypt Christians by giving concrete help. And I don't just mean the money or other forms of aid, but by affirming actions such as making our voice heard and taking up their plight with elected representatives and the other decision makers with influence in the area. And of course, I hope that EU members, the EU citizens, they're going to contact their MEPs and put the pressure and say that, hey, we have to protect the minorities and we have to protect Christian minorities. Exactly. They have also the right to exist in the Middle East and everywhere in the world.
Exactly. Thomas, I'll give you the last word. So we're down to about 2.5 minutes of the programme. So how can our viewers and why should our viewers get involved and actually be concerned about the plight of the persecuted church in the Arab world and in the Middle East, and also give them a voice here in the European Parliament?
I think it's obvious from listening to both Hanno and Paolo why we should be concerned and why we should get involved. The question, of course, remains, what can we do? We use, as you know, this motto, pray, educate, advocate in the European Coalition for Israel. And I think it relates to all sorts of issues that we are facing. I recall an interesting discussion, if it's true, I think it's true, between Stalin and his people after the war, concerning the Pope. And Stalin, they said, this Pope is creating some problem in Central and Eastern Europe. And Stalin said, well, how many legions does the Pope have? And I think history shows that, in particular, John Paul II and his role in bringing down the Iron Curtain was not a one-man show. These were thousands and thousands of Christians who came together to pray and really to stand for truth and justice, who made a difference. And the Iron Curtain came down. And I think we should take courage and see that it has happened in history before. It can happen again, but it also always starts with us. We can't blame the European Union or the national parliament or media or anyone else. It starts with us. It starts with me. And pray, educate, make sure you know the issues, do your homework, and then advocate. I mean, everyone has a voice. We live in a democracy. And you are more powerful than you can ever think. So as Hanno said, use your voice, in media, making contact with those who are elected leaders, and pray.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you for joining me on this edition of the European Report. And I want to thank you all for watching today's program. We discussed the seriousness of the situation in Syria, which is an incredible humanitarian crisis, and we have to be wary about getting involved in this conflict without really knowing the strategic ramifications of our involvement, particularly if the United States decides to involve itself in military action. But it's so important that we give a voice to those Christians and others who are caught up in this horrendous refugee problem, and also in this horrendous civil war that we're seeing now. And certainly in terms of morality, the use of the regime's chemical and biological weapons that's obviously sanctioned by the Iranian regime on their own people is something that the Western world should not tolerate, and we should learn our lessons from history. But also in terms of speaking up for the persecuted church, particularly in Egypt, as the Egyptian Christians have faced their own Kristallnacht. It's time that we shouldn't be silent. This is times that we should speak up on their behalf. We should contact our local MEP and let them know what's happening, so that we can give Christians a more powerful voice in Europe, to give the Christians in Egypt a voice, and also Christians facing persecution right across the Middle East. So let's continue to watch what's happening in the Middle East. Let's continue to pray for what's happening, and also let's get politically active. So I want to thank you for joining me on today's European report here from the heart of Europe in the European Parliament.